I'd owned the Wanderer for 11 years before Deena Miller ever set foot in Cattail Cove. She came in with the second wave of retirees who bought up the lots after the old marina co-op dissolved, and within 4 months she'd talked her way into the HOA presidency on a platform of restoring order to the waterfront. Nobody asked what disorder she meant. There wasn't any. There was just an old sailing yacht tied up at a dock that belonged to my family since before the HOA existed, on a stretch of shoreline my grandfather had deeded to the county as a public easement in 1961, which meant technically that my boat sat in water the HOA had never had any authority over in the first place. I didn't think that detail mattered yet. I was wrong about that, but not in the way you'd expect. Deena's first move was polite. A letter, laminated, taped to my gate, informing me that unregistered vessels exceeding 30 feet were now subject to a mooring compliance review. The Wanderer was 36 feet and registered with the state, the county, and the Coast Guard's documentation office, so I laughed it off and didn't respond. That was my mistake. Not because the letter had any teeth, but because silence gave her a paper trail to build on. 3 weeks later, I flew out to Ohio to help my sister move out of her house after her husband passed. I was gone 9 days. When I got back, the dock was empty. Not moved, empty. A section of my own decking had been torn up, my mooring lines cut and coiled neatly on the grass like someone wanted credit for tidiness, and out past the reeds, maybe 40 yards offshore in 6 feet of water, I could see the top of the Wanderer's mast leaning at an angle that told me everything before anyone said a word. The story I got from my neighbor Pete was that a contractor crew showed up on a Tuesday morning with a permit clipboard and a work order signed by the board, towed the boat out past the shallows, opened her through-hull fittings, and let her go down slow enough that nobody watching from shore thought of it what it was. Deena's version, when I finally got her on the phone, was that the HOA had followed proper abatement procedure for a derelict vessel that posed a hazard to the community, and that if I had a problem with it, I could take it up with the board at the next scheduled meeting, which happened to be 5 weeks out. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I went straight to the sheriff's substation and filed a report, and that's where things actually started going wrong for me, not for her. The deputy who took my statement looked at the property lines on file, looked at the HOA's paperwork, which by then had somehow acquired a notarized signature and a board resolution number, and told me that as far as county records showed, the water past the seawall fell under a private easement the HOA had registered 2 years earlier, an easement I had never seen, never signed off on, and had no memory of existing. Deena, it turned out, had spent her first year in office quietly filing amendments to shared use agreements that most of the older residents never read past the first page. On paper, she wasn't a vandal. She was a landlord evicting a tenant who'd overstayed. For about 10 days, she won. The board backed her unanimously. 2 neighbors who'd known my family for 20 years stopped waving at me at the mailbox because Deena had circulated an email describing me as confrontational and resistant to community standards. And there is nothing quite like watching people you trusted quietly decide you're the villain in a story that isn't the one you're living. I hired a lawyer. He told me the paperwork looked unusually clean for something drafted by a volunteer board, which is a polite way of saying he thought it had been backdated, but proving that would take months and money I didn't especially want to spend fighting a woman over a sunk boat. I remember standing on that torn-up dock thinking I'd lost, not because the law was against me, but because paperwork moves slower than humiliation does. What actually broke the case open wasn't a courtroom. It was a phone call I almost didn't take, from a number with a Norfolk area code 3 days after the report was filed. My son Caleb has been a Coast Guard Marine safety officer for 6 years, stationed 2 states away, and he only heard about any of this because Pete, of all people, had posted a photo of the sunken mast in a local boating forum, and someone in Caleb's unit, a guy who grew up 2 lakes over, recognized the cove and tagged him as a joke, not knowing whose boat it was. Caleb called me sounding less like my son and more like the officer he is, asking very specific questions about fuel type, tank capacity, and whether the vessel had been drained before it went under. It hadn't.
Nobody had drained anything. A 36-foot sailing yacht with a nearly full diesel tank had been deliberately sunk in a navigable easement that, under federal definition, wasn't actually private water at all. It connected to a tidal creek that fed the Sound, which put it squarely under Coast Guard and EPA jurisdiction the second fuel started leaching into it.
That's the part these stories always skip past, because it isn't dramatic on its own. An HOA board doesn't get to authorize the sinking of anything in water the federal government has already claimed regulatory authority over. And once a discharge is confirmed, it isn't a property dispute anymore. It's an environmental incident with a paper trail of its own. Caleb didn't come charging in with lights and sirens like you're picturing. He came in with a clipboard of his own 3 weeks later as part of an official pollution response inquiry. And he requested the HOA's abatement authorization records as part of that inquiry. The same backdated resolution my lawyer had flagged as unusually clean. Federal investigators have a different relationship with clean paperwork than county deputies do. They pulled the notary's log. The notarization date on Deena's easement amendment was stamped 4 days after the date typed on the document itself. I won't pretend the rest happened fast. It took the better part of a year. But once the notary fraud surfaced, the abatement reclassified as unauthorized discharge of a fuel-bearing vessel into federal waters, which under the Clean Water Act carries per day, per gallon civil penalties that have nothing to do with what a homeowners association can absorb. Deena wasn't fined a number that fits neatly into a headline. She was named personally, not the HOA, because the falsified resolution meant the board's insurance refused to cover any of it, which meant the judgment attached directly to her. She sold the house on Heron Point to cover the first settlement payment and still owed restitution for the cleanup crew that had to dredge diesel sediment out of a creek bed that 3 families downstream used for their well water testing. She doesn't sit on any HOA board anymore, in this state or the next one she moved to, because the case became part of a state legislative review into HOA authority over shared waterfront easements, and her name is attached to the bill that came out of it, whether she wanted it there or not. I never got the Wanderer back. Some things you don't recover, you just replace, slower and smaller than before. But there's a public mooring permit posted at Cattail Cove now that didn't exist before any of this, granting shoreline access rights that no future board can quietly amend away in a filing nobody reads. My son still won't talk about the investigation in detail, regulations, he says, but every so often he asks how the new boat's holding up, and I tell him she's smaller, but she floats, and that's more than the old one managed to do without help.